Hi, welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. I'm the Brewmaster. Today, we're going to be talking about how to build magic decks, and my two favorite methods of approaching that problem. If that sounds interesting to you, pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So when we build a magic deck, we all take different approaches to finding the cards that we want to include in our list. In my mind, there's two main ways to approach this. The first is top down, and the second is bottoms up. Now, if you've ever worked in development, you might have heard these terms, and I'm probably using them in a slightly different way. To me, top down refers to the main strategy of the deck, whatever you are trying to accomplish, whatever your win condition is. Taking that as the top of this pyramid and building legs out to support it. Most combo decks work in this fashion. It's very rare that you'll see a combo deck that can go in 10 to 15 different directions. Aggro decks, however, might be the opposite, where any one of their creatures along the way can get there eventually. And so that, I believe, is more of a bottoms-up strategy, where you use a collection of cards that are all strong, put into the same deck together to kind of build a strategy from those pieces. So when would we use these two different types of deck construction? Well, the first, top-down deck construction, I think serves a couple of purposes. It's really good if you don't have any cards to your name, because then you buy only the cards that you need to build that specific deck. Alternatively, if there's a very narrow strategy of a very narrow set of interactions that you are trying to employ, think back to the Griffin Canyon deck that I showed off a few weeks ago. You need 2 or 3 cards that interact very specifically in order to win the game. The odds of you having full playsets of those cards is probably low, so you're probably going to have to go buy those online. And back in the day, that wasn't so easy to do. Building a very narrow deck like that usually involved weeks or months of hunting for the cards that you needed. But now it's a lot easier, it's a lot more accessible, and it can be a lot cheaper if you don't have a large base of cards that you're starting with. However, in a bottoms-up deck, when you were looking to build from the cards that you already have on hand, it might lead you in different directions that you weren't expecting. I use bottoms-up deck construction when I don't really know what I want to make, or if I'm trying to build a monocolor EDH deck. I think it's really fun just to grab one of each of the best cards in a color, lay them out by mana cost, and then pick a legend to helm the boat. It also means that after the deck is built, any single legend in the entire deck can be your commander. So you get a really versatile mix of cards that you can throw together anytime you want, and get completely different gameplay experiences based on which legend you have running the deck. If you take a look at even CEDH decks that are running Crick or Yawgmoth as the commander, and you swap those out for, say, Chainer, or I have Ascendant Evensar in my deck as a legend that I think is an interesting commander, the deck becomes a lot less powerful, and the gameplay interactions change dramatically. You can still tutor up the same combos and play the same lines, but they're a little bit harder to get to. And I think that's really cool, and I think it makes for a really flexible gameplay experience. And that's one of the big benefits of building bottoms up. You don't rely on the interactions of that commander, of that final finishing move that's in your deck, in order to win the game. You're a little more flexible, a little more versatile, and as you open new cards from packs, you can slot them in a little bit easier. So today, I want to talk about a deck that I built, fully bottoms up, relying on Yurlok of Scorched Thrash as the commander. The idea of the deck is to throw the game back to the 90s, back before treasure tokens, back before extremely fast mana rocks, back to the days of playing big creatures and dealing with that ticking clock of everybody's life total going down turn after turn. So come on over here, check it out. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think you will too. So let's take a second to run through the cards that are in this deck and explain briefly what we're trying to accomplish. Now our commander is Yurlok of Scorched Thrash. If you haven't seen this before, he's a 4/4 with Vigilance that turns mana burn back on. If you played way back in the day, you know that mana burn was not super impactful most of the time, but when it mattered a lot. And so he makes it so that you take damage anytime you can't spend all the mana that you've produced. Finally, he has a really slick little ability that adds mana to everyone's mana pool. You put 1 mana in, tap him, and he produces 3 for everyone on the table. 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green. The first few cards we have, I think, are in most Yurlok decks, but they're generally combo-oriented. Now, a couple of these I proxied in Old Border because I think they look cooler than their non-Old Border versions. But essentially, you have 2 cards that allow you to untap Yurlok, and 1 card that allows him to tap for more mana. Fun rules interaction on that. He taps for 1 mana for everybody at the table, so instead of producing 3 mana, he produces 4. That allows us to go infinite with Umbral Mantle, and a little more infinite with Staff of Domination. Something I'll also note with this deck, it is never wrong to burn everybody at the table, including yourself. You want to keep this game fair and even. So that brings us to our second set of cards. This is just generally good, high damage stuff. Some of these can feed into combos. The first is Concordant Crossroads, gives everything haste. It allows you to use your commander on the first turn you play it. That's really handy. Aggravated Assault. The only part we care about is 5 mana to untap all creatures we control. Occasionally you'll use this for additional attacks, but typically if you are using that ability, you have enough creatures that produce mana that you go infinite. You need to be a little careful here because you will also burn yourself with mana burn if you have any mana left over. So be very careful about getting to that 5 mana. Third is Chainer. It allows us to play creatures out of our graveyard and discard cards. Nature's Emergence turns all of our lands into 2/2 creatures. That means these 2 often represent a win condition. Life also turns all your creatures into 1/1 creatures, all of your lands into 1/1 creatures. Similar thing. It can also bring things back from the graveyard, which is really handy. Karn is a good blocker, reasonable attacker, and can also turn any artifacts into creatures. So that becomes really cool when we can turn our Soul Ring into a creature for the purpose of Aggravated Assault or any of these other cards, or if we want to just start turning our opponent's treasure tokens into creatures, or our opponent's clues into creatures. He becomes 1 mana, destroy target artifact token, which is very fun for us. Not so much for them. But those are just good stuff. The next pile here represents things that change the state of the board. Price of Glory, whenever a player taps a land during an opponent's turn, they have to sack it. Turns off most counter spells, a lot of interaction, which is kind of a fun card. Power Surge. This is if you need to untap a land and it's already untapped, instead it deals damage to you, so it forces your opponents to tap out before they start their turn. Spell Shock. You take 2 damage every time you cast a spell, but so do they. Price of Progress. Everyone takes 2 damage for each non-basic land they control. Mana Barbs. You take damage every time you tap a land for mana. Tectonic Instability. Whenever a land comes into play, it taps all lands that player controls. So if you play a land, you're tapping out that turn. Citadel of Pain. At the end of your turn, you take damage for each untapped land you control. There's a theme here. We want to force our opponent to tap out anytime they tap lands, and we want them to keep them from tapping out during other players' turns. This means the only mana they can use during other players' turns is the mana that we give them. It can be a fun political tool, but on top of that, it also means that typically we don't have to worry about interaction quite so much. Then we move into green. We have Primal Order. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they take damage equal to their non-basic lands. More of this non-basic land hate. Ground Seal. This shuts off any graveyard deck at the cost of green and colorless, and it draws you a card when it comes into play. Titania's Song ruins treasure tokens, is its main effect. Secondarily, though, it turns off all artifacts. All artifacts become dumb vanilla creatures. Really, really cool. Ritual of Subdual. Lands only tap for colorless manas. There are decks that will fold just by playing this card. It does have a cumulative upkeep of 2, but we don't care so much because we produce a ton of mana, and because our commander's producing our colors, we can typically still cast the things that we want to cast. We're running Destructive Flow. At the beginning of each player's turn, they sack a non-basic land. Again, completely fair. Everybody experiences this. And then we have a few artifacts here. Null Rod turns off all artifacts. Ankh of Mishra deals damage whenever you play a land. Winter's Orb, you only untap 1 land each turn. Don't care, our creatures make mana. Ensnaring Bridge, things can't attack us if they're bigger than our hand. And Karn the Great Creator, other players' artifacts don't do anything. There's a theme here of hating non-basic lands and artifacts, and that's intentional. You might use other cards depending on what your playgroup uses, but again, my focus is on making the game fair. And in my playgroup, artifacts and non-basic lands do a whole bunch of unfair things. So this keeps it in check. Now we move on to the heart and soul of this deck, producing mana. So this is going to be a Chrome Mox, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet. Pretty standard fare for being able to tap things to make more mana. We're running a Wirewood Symbiote, which untaps creatures that tap for mana, including our commander. We have a couple things that do this, but the next suite of cards is going to all be creatures that tap for mana. Birds of Paradise, Elves of Deep Shadow, Wirewood Champion. Oh, Wirewood Channeler, sorry. Llanowar Elf. Here's another card that untaps Seeker of Skybreak. And you'll notice that all of these are elves, so things like Wirewood Channeler or Priest of Titania can tap for a whole bunch of mana. Argothian Elder untaps 2 target lands. We have a couple lands in here that can produce extra mana. It represents an infinite mana combo with a Wirewood Lodge. Just general handy stuff. Wood Elves. This is a good tutor for any forest. Quirion Explorer changes mana to what we need it to be. Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elder, Fyndhorn Elves. Whole bunch of creatures that tap for mana. Now we have a whole bunch of cards that search for lands. Nature's Lore, Skyshroud Claim, Natural Balance. Instill Energy is another untapped target creature card. So the focus here is that all of our creatures are producing mana. We can search for additional lands, and we can untap the ones that are extremely impactful. All of this feeds into some of our combo pieces that require a lot of mana in order to untap and tap things. But that'll allow us to funnel a whole lot of mana onto our opponents. The next few cards here are specifically to throw off our opponent's curve. We have Mana Flare, Eldamri's Vineyard, and Overabundance. With our commander, if we can force our opponent to have too many cards in their hand that cost odd mana costs or can't be used with green mana, we can cause them to take mana burn. Every little bit helps. So those are really handy to have. Then bridging the gap here between our search for lands and produce mana and draw cards, we have Solemn Simulacrum. I believe this card belongs in almost every commander deck. It's very strong. It's not super competitive, but at 4 mana, it does everything you want it to do, especially if you have a way of bringing things back from the graveyard. The next set of cards that we have here draw cards for us. We're using Read the Bones to scry 2, then draw 2, Phyrexian Arena. Zira Erin. Flying Bug Creature uses the exact mana that Yurlok produces to allow target player to draw a card. Usually that target player is us. We have some soft draw in Sylvan Library, Bolas' Citadel, and Eternal Witness. These are cards that allow us to get additional things into our hand at a cost. Bolas' Citadel plays things off the top, Eternal Witness takes a thing out of the graveyard, and Sylvan Library allows us to pay life to draw more cards. We're going to be burning the table for a lot of damage, so sometimes it's a good tempo play to keep fueling our hand by adding more cards. Worldly Tutor searches for any creature. This will usually be some sort of combo piece with either Wirewood Channeler or Priest of Titania. We have a Hull Breach for some removal. And then we have the rest of our removal suite being Pernicious Deed, Fanning the Flames, Hurricane, Culling Verse, and Meltdown. A lot of those spells are X spells, with a good reason. We're going to be producing a lot of mana, and we need to have a place to put that mana. Each of these X spells represents a sizable threat to the table, and a good answer to a number of different decks. And that essentially wraps us up for all of our removal spells, mana spells, and other general support that we want to use to kind of fuel out the rest of our deck. Finally, we move on to lands. We have some mana fixing in here, some of the old school Sulphurous Springs, Carpulsion Forest, Overgrown Tomb, and Stomping Ground. I'm really excited for these coming out in Old Border. If you haven't noticed yet, every card in this deck is Old Border except for these two and a couple others that I had to get proxied in Old Border just to fit the theme. Then we have some fun utility things like Treetop Village and Wirewood Lodge, a couple of colorless and searchers using Ancient Tomb Fabled Passage. A City of Brass and a Grand Colosseum produce whatever color we need them to produce. And you might notice there's some nombo in the fact that we have a lot of hate for non-basic lands, but we are running quite a few non-basic lands. It's because we don't care about damage to ourselves, and our goal is to keep the game fair. And there's nothing more fair than dealing damage to yourself. Finally, we look at our basics. We have 7 mountains, 12 forests, and 7 swamps. And that rounds us out for our base 100 cards. But again, like I said at the outset, this deck was built from the bottom up. Which means not only do we have this selection of great cards, we have a whole side deck of other cards that didn't quite make the cut, but might make the cut at your table. So all of these cards are really handy in different situations, but aren't necessarily useful in the current build of the deck. I'm sure at some point they'll be substituted in, but for the time being, this is the state of the deck that I'm going with, and I'm really happy with the way that it is able to control the board and completely change the way the game is played. Thanks for having a look at that Yurlok deck. I know there's a lot of ways to build a Magic deck, and there's a number of different methods that we didn't even talk about. Building packages that exist independently within a singular deck. Building a toolbox that can search for a selection of individual cards to handle different circumstances. Building decks with a transformational sideboard that completely changes the way the deck plays from game 1 to game 2. And I think as new sets come out, new cards are released, we're going to see many more ways to build a deck. But today, this was my deck built using fully bottoms-up deck construction, and I encourage you to give it a shot. Take that box of cards that you don't use anymore, and just try building a deck from it. I promise you, strategies will emerge and different gameplay methods that you wouldn't have thought of right off the bat might come in the middle of a game. So give it a shot, build a deck, try it out, and you might find yourself playing in a way that you haven't seen for 2 decades. I know I have a lot of fun with it. I hope you do too. It's been really nice talking to you.